The road was long, but he knew where he was going. He would follow the old road through the swamp and up over the ridge and down to a deep ravine and cross the sagging timbers of the bridge, and on the other side would be the place called Tinkhamtown. He was going back to Tinkhamtown. He walked slowly, for his legs were dragging, and he had not been walking for a long time. He had not walked for almost a year, and his flanks had shriveled and wasted away from lying in bed so long. He could fit his fingers around his thigh. Doc Toll had said he would never walk again, but that was Doc for you, always on the pessimistic side. Why, here he was, walking quite easily once he had started. The strength was coming back into his legs, and he did not have to stop for breath so often. He tried jogging a few steps just to show he could, but he slowed again because he had a long way to go. It was hard to make out the old road, choked with young alders and drifted over with matted leaves, and he shut his eyes so he could see it better. He could always see it when he shut his eyes. Yes, here was the beaver dam on the right, just as he remembered it, and the flooded stretch where he had to wade, picking his way from hummock to hummock, while the dog splashed unconcernedly in front of him. The water had been over his boot tops in one place, and sure enough, as he waded it now, his left boot filled with water again, the same warm, squidgy feeling. Everything was the way it had been that afternoon. Nothing had changed. Here was the blowdown across the road that he had clambered over, and here on a knoll was the clump of thorn apples where Cider had put up a grouse. He remembered the sudden roar as the grouse thundered out, and the easy shot that he missed. They had not taken the time to go after it. Cider had wanted to look for it, but he had whistled him back. They were looking for Tinkhamtown. Everything was the way he remembered. There was a fork in the road, and he halted and felt in the pocket of his hunting coat and took out the map he had drawn 20 years ago. He had copied it from a chart he found in the town hall, rolled up in a cardboard cylinder covered with dust. He used to study the old survey charts. Sometimes they showed where a farming community had flourished once, and around the abandoned pastures and under the apple trees grown up to pine, the grouse would be feeding undisturbed. Some of his best grouse covers had been located that way. The chart had crackled with age as he unrolled it. The date was 1847. It was the sector between Kearsarge and Cardigan Mountains, a wasteland of slash and second-growth timber, without habitation today, but evidently it had supported a number of families before the Civil War. A road was marked on the map, dotted with X's for homesteads, and the names of the owners were lettered beside them. Nason, J. Tinkham, Libby, Allard, R. Tinkham. Half the names were Tinkham. In the center of the map, the paper was so yellow he could barely make it out, was the word Tinkhamtown. He copied the chart carefully, noting where the road turned off at the base of Kearsarge and ran north and then northeast and crossed a brook that was not even named on the chart. And early the next morning, he and Cider had set out together to find the place. They could not drive very far in the Jeep because washouts had gutted the roadbed and laid bare the ledges and boulders like a stream bed. He had stuffed the sketch in his hunting coat pocket and hung his shotgun over his forearm and started walking, the old setter trotting ahead of him with the bell on his collar tinkling. It was an old-fashioned sleigh bell, and it had a thin, silvery note that echoed through the woods like peepers in the spring. He could follow the sound in the thickest cover, and when it stopped, He would go to where he heard it last, and Cider would be on point. After Cider's death, he had put the bell away. He'd never had another dog. It was silent in the woods without the bell, and the way was longer than he remembered. He looked up, and through the trees, he could see the hill. He started walking again, carrying a shotgun. He had left the gun standing in its rack in the kitchen when he had been taken to the state hospital, but now it was hooked over his arm by the trigger guard. He could feel the solid heft of it. The woods were more dense as he climbed, but here and there a shaft of sunlight slanted through the trees. And the forests, ancient as the hills, he thought, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. Funny that should come back to him now. He hadn't read it since he was a boy. Other things were coming back to him. The smell of the dank leaves, the sweet fern, and the frosted apples, the sharp contrast of sun and the cold November shade, the stillness before snow. He walked faster, feeling the excitement swell within him. He had walked all that morning, stopping now and then to study the map and take his bearings from the sun, and the road had led him down a long hill, and at the bottom was the brook he had seen on the chart, a deep ravine spanned by a wooden bridge. Cider had trotted across the bridge, and he had followed more cautiously, avoiding the loose planks and walking the solid struts with his shotgun held out to balance himself. And that was how he found Tinkhamtown. On the other side of the brook was a clearing, he remembered, and the remains of a stone wall and a cellar hole where a farmhouse had stood. Cider had moved in a long cast around the edge of the clearing, his bell tinkling faintly, and he had paused a moment beside the foundations, wondering about the people who had lived here a century ago. Had they ever come back to Tinkhamtown? And then suddenly the bell had stopped, and he had hurried across the clearing. An apple tree was growing in a corner of the stone wall, and under the tree, Cider halted at point. He could see it all now, the warm October sunlight, the ground strewn with freshly pecked apples, the dog standing immobile with one foreleg drawn up, his back level and his tail a white plume. Only his flanks quivered a little, and a string of slobber dangled from his jowls. "Steady, boy," he murmured as he moved up behind him. "I'm coming." He paused on the crest of the hill, straining his ears for the faint mutter of the stream below him, but he could not hear it because of the voices. He wished they would stop talking so he could hear the stream. Someone was saying his name over and over. Someone said, "What is it, Frank?" And he opened his eyes. Doc Toll was standing at the foot of the bed, whispering to the new nurse, Mrs. Simmons or something. She'd only been here a few days, but Doc thought it would take some of the burden off his wife. He turned his head on the pillow and looked up at his wife's face bent over him. "What did you say, Frank?" she asked, and her face was worried. Why, there was nothing to be worried about. He wanted to tell her where he was going, but when he moved his lips, no sound came. "What?" she asked, bending her head lower. "I don't hear you." He couldn't make the words any clearer, and she straightened and said to Doc Toll, it sounded something like Tinkhamtown. Tinkhamtown? Doc shook his head. Never heard him mention any place by that name. He smiled to himself. Of course he'd never mentioned it to Doc. There are some things you don't mention even to an old hunting companion like Doc. Things like a secret grouse cover you didn't mention to anyone, not even to as close a friend as Doc was. "This is our secret cover," he had told Cider that afternoon as he lay sprawled under the tree with the setter beside him and the dog's muzzle flattened on his thigh. "Just you and me." He had never told anybody else about Tinkhamtown, and he had never gone back after Cider died. Doc used to argue that what's over is over, but he would insist Doc was wrong. everything is the way it was, he'd tell Doc. The present always changes, but the past is always the way it was. You leave it and go to the present, but it is still there, waiting for you to come back to it. His eyes were blurred with tears, but he did not need to see. The fear was gone. He was not alone. He knew the way now. He knew where he was going. He paused at the stream just for a moment. He heard men's voices. They were his hunting partners, Jim, Mac, Dan, Woody. And oh, what a day it was for sure. Closeness and understanding and happiness. The little intimate things, the private jokes. He wanted to tell them he was happy. If they only knew how happy he was. He opened his eyes, but he could not see the room anymore. Everything else was bright with sunshine, but the room was dark. The bell stopped, and he closed his eyes and looked across the stream. The other side was basked in gold bright sunshine, and he could see the road rising steeply through the clearing in the woods, and the apple tree in a corner of the stone wall. Cider was standing motionless. The white fan of his tail lifted a little, his neck craned forward, one foreleg cocked. The whites of his eyes showed as he looked back, waiting for him. "Steady," he called. "Steady, boy." He started across the bridge. "I'm coming."